What if one night someone you love vanished without a trace? And what if weeks later a voice you don't know calls you and says only this: I have her? What happens if that same voice continues to call at the same time every week for 4 long years, just to torture the victim's mother? Who was this anonymous caller who ambushed an ordinary mother in the dead of night? And what did he do to 32-year-old Dorothy Scott? I'm Detective Barack. If you're ready, let's begin. Behind every missing person poster, behind every newspaper headline, there is a person just like us, with dreams, fears, and loved ones. Dorothy Jane Scott was one of them, a 32-year-old mother, full of life. Her friends and family described her as a homebody. Parties, loud gatherings, those weren't really Dorothy's scene. For her, happiness was hidden in quieter moments. She was a private, religious woman, and her greatest priority was her only son, whom she loved more than anything. At the center of her life was her 4-year-old son, Sean. She had built her entire world around him. Working as a secretary in an office in Stanton, she was a single mother, playing the role of both father and mother to her son. Her biggest dream was to see Sean grow up safe and happy. But beneath the surface of the seemingly calm life, a dark shadow was slowly weaving a web of fear around Dorothy. For the last few months, an unidentified man had been calling her regularly. Sometimes he would profess his love for her, other times he would threaten to cut her into pieces. He even left a single black rose for her at work once. Dorothy was terrified by this. She told a few people about the calls, and had even considered starting a karate course to protect herself. She was just an ordinary mother who wanted to raise her child, but someone had become obsessed with her. So who was the owner of this obsessive voice that had descended upon Dorothy's life like a nightmare? And why had he chosen Dorothy as his target? The year is 1980, Orange County, California. In those years, this place was like a poster for the American dream. Calm, orderly suburbs stretching out right next to the magical lights of Disneyland, where families started new lives. Stanton and Anaheim, where Dorothy lived and worked, were exactly such places. A picture of tranquility from the outside. But beneath this shiny surface lay the reality of that era. This was a time very different from today's world. There were no cell phones. The internet, social media, security cameras watching every street. None of these could even be imagined. This was also a time when a predator could silently stalk his victim, remaining an anonymous threat at the end of a telephone line. A world where calling for help was much harder, and disappearing was much easier. The anonymous telephone terror that Dorothy Scott was living through and had been forced to endure for the past few months was growing in this very technological void. The voice that called her was like a ghost. It made its presence felt, but never revealed its identity. For the police, tracing it was nearly impossible. In this seemingly safe neighborhood, where everyone thought they knew each other and doors went unlocked, who could have known that an ordinary mother had become the target of a monster? And that monster was waiting for the right moment to strike. The night of May 28th, 1980.
Every story of a disappearance has a starting point. For Dorothy Scott, that day, May 28, 1980, began like any other. She went to work, handled paperwork, and chatted with her colleagues. But as darkness fell, the webs of fate began to be spun. There was a staff meeting at work that evening. One of Dorothy's coworkers, Conrad Bostrom, wasn't feeling well due to a spider bite. He was pale and his condition was worsening. Dorothy, with her usual kindness, decided to take Conrad to the hospital along with another coworker, Pam Head. But before they went to the hospital, something strange happened. Dorothy took off the red scarf she had been wearing all day and put on a black one instead. The sentence she said to her family, who noticed the change, was quite odd. The red one is for my boss and the black one is for Conrad. Was there a hidden message behind this simple sentence, or was it just a meaningless detail? This question would occupy the minds of detectives for a long time. As the clock neared 11 p.m., the 3 coworkers were at the UC Irvine Medical Center. Doctors had examined Conrad and decided to discharge him. Conrad's arm was bandaged and he was still in pain. Dorothy didn't want to make her tired and hurting friend walk any further. In that moment, she made the simple offer that would change the entire story. "You guys wait here," she said. "I'll go get the car and bring it to the entrance." Pam and Conrad began to wait at the hospital exit. A few minutes later, a pair of headlights appeared in the darkness. It was Dorothy's white Toyota Celica. The car approached them quickly, but instead of slowing down, it sped past them at full throttle, shot out of the parking lot, and disappeared into the dark of the night. Pam and Conrad were stunned. Maybe there was an emergency with Dorothy's son, Sean. Maybe she just wanted to get home quickly. They waited a while longer, but Dorothy didn't come back. The receding taillights of that white car were the last known sighting of Dorothy Scott.
On the morning of May 29, around 5:30 a.m., about 10 miles from the hospital, smoke was rising from an alley next to a construction site in Santa Ana. Police, responding to a call, found the white Toyota Celica they were looking for. But what they found was not so much a car as the skeleton of a nightmare. The car was completely burned. The heat of the flames had been so intense that the metal had twisted and everything inside had turned to unrecognizable ash. This was no accident. It was a fire deliberately set to destroy evidence. But the most chilling discovery for the detectives was what wasn't in the car. There was no trace of Dorothy Scott. The crime scene investigation team began to examine every square centimeter around the ashen wreck with surgical precision. Every particle of ash, every grain of dirt could tell a story. So what did this burned out heap of metal tell them? First, no signs of a struggle, no blood stains, nor any indication of a body being dragged were found around the car. This suggested that the attack on Dorothy had likely not happened here, in this desolate alley. She had been ambushed somewhere else, and the car was later brought here and set on fire. Second, the fact that the fire was intentional revealed that the perpetrator acted in a cold-blooded and planned manner. His choice of this deserted alley was proof of how careful he was to leave no witnesses. The detectives were left with only a burned-out car and a massive void. At this point, the most critical questions on their minds were, where had the killer taken Dorothy from the car, and what microscopic clue did these flames conceal from the police's view? The investigation had begun by chasing a ghost. At the heart of every investigation lies an interrogation room. This is the place where truths, along with beads of sweat, are spilled onto a cold metal table. In the Dorothy Scott case, detectives were searching for a face in the dark, and at the very top of the suspect list was a ghost, that anonymous telephone stalker. This voice had to belong to someone. Everyone in Dorothy's life was a potential suspect. Detectives began to turn over every stone in her social circle. First, Conrad Bostron and Pam Head, the last people to see Dorothy, were questioned. Their stories were consistent. Their shock and concern were genuine. The detectives were quickly convinced they had nothing to do with the incident. But one name stood out more than the others: Mike Butler. Mike was one of Dorothy's co-workers. According to witness statements, however, this relationship had gone beyond a typical professional one. It was alleged that Mike was obsessed with Dorothy, that he constantly harassed her, and that he wouldn't leave her alone despite being rejected. It was rumored that Mike might have been one of the reasons behind Dorothy's desire to take karate lessons. When Mike Butler was brought into the interrogation room, he denied all the allegations. He said he was at home that night. He was calm. But the detectives sensed something behind this composed demeanor. There were small, subtle inconsistencies in his statement. However, there was no concrete evidence to connect him to the night of Dorothy's disappearance. The question on the detectives' minds was simple. Was Mike Butler the owner of the obsessive voice that had been calling Dorothy for months, sending her black roses? Was his denial the plea of an innocent man, or the ice-cold composure of a killer? The police had suspicions, yes, but to charge someone you need more than suspicion. You need proof, and the proof was not yet there.
An investigation is like a web woven with patience. Detectives try to narrow the circle around the killer by connecting the smallest clues they have. But in the Dorothy Scott case, the hunter was always one step ahead of the prey. The first few weeks were a complete disappointment. The burned car had given them nothing. There were suspects like Mike Butler, but no concrete evidence against them. The investigation was in danger of becoming a cold case. And then the phone rang. This was the darkest and most bizarre turning point in the investigation. About a week after Dorothy's disappearance, an unidentified man began calling Dorothy's mother, Vera Scott. The voice on the phone was muffled and unrecognizable. Sometimes he would say, "I have her," and other times he would cruelly taunt the family by saying Dorothy was still alive and would be home soon. These calls became a routine. Almost every Wednesday evening, that ghostly voice would echo again in the Scott family home. For the detectives, this was an incredible opportunity. The killer was communicating with them. A listening and recording system was immediately installed at the Scott family's house. The detectives lay in wait every Wednesday, waiting for that call. The plan was simple.
Keep the caller on the line for as long as possible and, in the meantime, trace the call's origin. But the killer was clever. He always made the calls from different payphones and kept them very short. The technology of the era wasn't fast enough to pinpoint a call's location instantly. The killer would hang up just as the police were getting close to finding him, melting back into the darkness until the following week. This was quite literally a cat and mouse game. The killer was challenging the police, mocking them, and sending the message that he was in control of the investigation. For the detectives, there could be no situation more frustrating. They could hear the voice of a ghost, but they couldn't touch him. In a case, witnesses can lie, suspects can deny, but science, under the right conditions, whispers the truth. In the Dorothy Scott case, detectives knocked on the door of forensic science to hear that whisper. But what they encountered were more new questions than answers. The killer's first move was to destroy one of the greatest weapons of forensic science, physical evidence, from the very beginning. The burning car had turned potential fingerprints, hair strands, bloodstains, or fabric fibers into ash. This was a professional move that tied the investigation's hands. And then, after 4 long years of silence, a phone call came. But this time, it wasn't the killer calling. A construction worker, while digging, had found bones he suspected were human. The teams that went to the scene were met with a partial skeleton. Now it was science's time to speak. Forensic odontology, identification through dental records, came into play. Dorothy's dental records were compared with the discovered remains. The result was conclusive. 4 years later, the missing Dorothy Scott had been found. After a painful 4-year wait, forensic science gave Dorothy Scott her name back. For her family, this was, on one hand, a bitter end, and on the other, the end of uncertainty. But these bones held the answer to the most important question like a secret. How did Dorothy die? The remains had been exposed to the elements for so long that determining the cause of death was impossible. Evidence like a gunshot wound, a knife mark, or strangulation had long since disappeared. The autopsy report's conclusion contained that devastating phrase, cause of death undetermined. There was another curious detail. Next to Dorothy's bones, the bones of a dog were also found. Was this a coincidence or a coded message left by the killer? Forensic science had confirmed who Dorothy was, but couldn't say what had happened to her. This was the moment when the limits of science succumbed to the cruelty of a killer. When a person disappears, first their family, then the police search for them. But if the story is dark and mysterious enough, a third force joins the search: the media. The Dorothy Scott case had everything to whet the media's appetite: an innocent victim, a mysterious disappearance, and most importantly, a killer who taunted the police. Initially a local news story, Dorothy's disappearance turned into a national sensation, especially with those mysterious phone calls. This was no longer just a missing person case, it was a thriller living in the headlines with a new chapter written every day. As newspapers and television followed the case moment by moment, a seed of fear was planted in the quiet suburbs of Orange County. People started double-locking their doors, looking around anxiously when passing through hospital parking lots at night. This story had triggered the "it could happen to anyone" fear. This intense media attention was a double-edged sword for the investigation. On one hand, it ensured that Dorothy's face and story were not forgotten, leading to a constant stream of new tips for the police. It was a fire that kept the case from going cold. But the other side of the coin was much darker. The biggest question on the detectives' minds was this media attention feeding the killer's massive ego? Was every headline, every news report serving his cruel game? The killer himself answered this question in a way that left no room for doubt. On June 12, 1980, the phone rang at the local newspaper, the Santa Ana Register. The caller was the same muffled voice that had been harassing Dorothy's mother. But what he said this time was blood-curdling. The man on the phone knew a detail that only Dorothy's closest circle and the police knew: that Conrad Bostron had been bitten by a spider on the night of the incident. And then he uttered this sentence: "I killed her because she was cheating on me." The killer was now addressing not just the family and the police, but the entire world through the media. He was using the headlines as a tool to publish his own dark manifesto. The investigation was now being conducted not only at a crime scene, but also on the pages of newspapers. When a case goes cold, it's not just the ghosts of evidence that remain,
but the ghosts of questions. The Dorothy Scott case left behind just such an army of ghosts. Years passed, but the most fundamental questions about that night and its aftermath still echo in the darkness. Who and why? At this point, three main theories took shape in the minds of detectives and amateur investigators. Theory 1, the obsessed coworker Mike Butler. This is the theory the police focused on the most and the one that seems most plausible. What we have? A man known to be obsessed with Dorothy. Witness statements indicating that he harassed her, was rejected, and couldn't accept it. The motive is quite clear: rage born from rejection and an obsessive desire for possession. It was also highly likely that as a coworker, he knew Dorothy would be at the hospital that night. Could he have been the owner of that mysterious telephone voice? The weak point, but there is always a but. Not a single piece of concrete physical evidence was ever found to link Mike Butler to that night or to the phone calls. There was strong suspicion, yes, but suspicion is not enough to convict someone. Theory 2, the religious cult connection. This is a less discussed but equally chilling theory. Dorothy and her family were known to be connected to a non-mainstream Christian group at the time. According to some claims, Dorothy was considering leaving this group. The theory suggests that the obsessive voice calling her was someone from this sect who saw Dorothy's desire to leave as a betrayal. Indeed, the killer's statement to the newspaper, "She was cheating on me," might not just refer to a romantic betrayal, but a spiritual one. The weak point, however, this theory is built more on whispers and assumptions than on concrete evidence. No name or event ever emerged to prove this connection. Theory 3, a random attack. It is always a possibility. Dorothy was an innocent victim in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was targeted by a predator lying in wait in the hospital parking lot that night. The weak point, this theory completely fails to explain the most bizarre aspect of the case: the phone calls. Why would a random attacker call the victim's family for 4 years? Why subject them to psychological torture? And most importantly, how would he know a specific detail like the spider bite, which was only known to those who were there that night? An obsessed coworker? A shadowy member of a religious cult? Or a third option we haven't even considered? Which do you think is more plausible? I'd like to hear your theories in the comments.
Some crimes wound not just the victim and their family, but the very soul of the community they belong to. The disappearance of Dorothy Scott and the events that followed created a deep crack in the sunny, safe image of Orange County. This case was a painful proof that evil can lie in wait in even the most ordinary, unexpected places. In the aftermath, a climate of distrust and fear spread among the people in the area. The motto, "Know thy neighbor," was replaced by the suspicion of who is behind that door. The most normal places of daily life, like hospital parking lots and supermarket exits, suddenly turned into potential danger zones. People, especially women, became much more anxious about going out alone at night. This fear also triggered a reflex. Neighborhood watch programs became more popular. People began to observe each other and their surroundings more carefully. The Dorothy Scott case fundamentally shook the community's perception of safety and pushed people to be more proactive about their own security. But perhaps the most tangible societal impact of this case was in the realm of technology and communication. The inability of the police at that time to instantly trace phone calls had made the killer's years-long campaign of telephone terror possible. Cases like Dorothy's were tragic examples that underscored the need for the development of emergency hotlines and phone tracking technologies. It showed the importance of steps to be taken so that future investigations would not fall behind a killer's use of technology. Dorothy's story went beyond an individual's tragedy and was etched into the collective memory of a community. It became a bitter lesson, a reminder of how fragile trust is and how darkness waits like a shadow even in the brightest seeming places.
An investigation file can be closed. Newspaper headlines can move on to the next story. But for a family, the loss never ends. For Dorothy Scott's family, the search for justice turned into a lifelong, unceasing pain. For them, the greatest torture was the uncertainty, that agonizing spiral of hope and despair that comes from not knowing if Dorothy was alive or dead. Startling at every knock on the door, at every ring of the phone, wondering, could it be her? This was living in an indescribable limbo. And that phone, that cruel voice, this wasn't just harassment. It was a dagger plunged into the family's soul again every week. For 4 long years, Dorothy's mother Vera showed the courage to answer that phone every Wednesday. Why? Because she held onto that tiny, painful sliver of hope that the voice might give a clue about her daughter's fate.
The caller would sometimes say Dorothy was fine and would be home soon, raising the family's hopes. Other times, he would say he had her, renewing their pain. In an interview years later, Vera Scott would say she believed the voice belonged to her daughter's killer because the caller knew details that only the closest family members knew, such as an infection Dorothy had been suffering from. And then there was Sean, the little boy who was only 4 years old when his mother disappeared. He had to grow up without his mother. The family, while trying to cope with their own grief, fought to protect Sean from this terrible truth and to provide him with a future. In 1984, when Dorothy's remains were found, that terrible uncertainty ended. But it was replaced by the weight of an irreversible certainty. The funeral was less of a farewell and more like a vow that the quest for justice would never end. The Scott family, even though the killer was never found, never for a moment gave up the fight to keep Dorothy's memory alive and not let her story be forgotten. Their pain remains the most real, most tangible legacy of this case.
Some stories don't just get lost on the dusty shelves of time, because they are not just an anatomy of a crime, but a mirror held up to the darkest and most complex aspects of human nature. That is precisely why Dorothy Scott's story, despite all the years that have passed, has not been erased from memory. So what is it that makes this case so unforgettable? Perhaps the biggest reason is the unsettling mystery at the heart of the case. The unanswered questions, a killer who was never found. This void creates a space that our minds want to fill, a space upon which we constantly write scenarios. Dorothy's story, like an unsolved puzzle, continues to draw in every new generation that hears it. Secondly, those cruel phone calls. This is the detail that elevates the case beyond an ordinary murder investigation, adding an element of almost supernatural horror. For a killer to psychologically torture his victim's family for such a long time is a level of evil that pushes the boundaries of comprehension. This is not just about stealing a person's life, but also about poisoning the souls of those left behind. And finally, Dorothy herself. She could have been any one of us, an ordinary mother living an ordinary life whose only concern was raising her child. Her story reminds us of our own vulnerability. It shows us how, even in the moments we feel safest, our lives can suddenly turn into a nightmare. Dorothy's legacy is so much more than a forensic file or a newspaper archive. Her legacy lives in every unanswered question, in her family's unending pain, and in the whisper of why that awakens within us every time we hear this story. This case is a bitter lesson that teaches us that justice is not always served, but the fight to find the truth must never end.
As we close every mystery file, there's a question we must ask ourselves. What did we learn from this? Dorothy Scott's tragedy is not just a story from the past, but a lesson that contains important warnings for today's world. What can we do to prevent such incidents from happening again? The first and most important lesson is to trust your instincts. Dorothy was afraid of the voice that was calling her. She sensed the threat and shared it with those close to her. If someone is making you uncomfortable, if you think you're being followed, or if their behavior makes you feel unsafe, never dismiss it by telling yourself, "I'm overreacting." You must share this situation with people you trust and with the authorities. Today's technology offers far more opportunities to document and prove harassment than in the 1980s. Take screenshots, save messages, keep call logs. These small details could become the most important evidence to protect you in the future. Secondly, environmental awareness. Dorothy was targeted at night in a deserted hospital parking lot. Being aware of our surroundings, especially at night, is vitally important. Simple habits like quickly checking your surroundings when getting into or out of your car and not walking while distracted by your phone can help you notice a potential danger in advance. And finally, social responsibility. If you hear that a friend or a relative is being harassed or is afraid of someone, take it seriously. Instead of saying, "Forget it, don't worry about it," ask, "How can I help you?" Sometimes the thing a victim needs most is to feel understood and to know they are not alone. We now have the technological means and awareness that did not exist in Dorothy Scott's time. The lessons we draw from her story may help us prevent the next potential tragedy.
Dorothy Scott's story is a painful reminder that justice can sometimes fall silent. Her killer may never be found in this world, but that does not mean she will be forgotten. We at the Detective Barack channel exist for this very reason, to reopen forgotten files, to make silent screams heard, and to ask the unanswered questions, because every victim has a story, and every story deserves to be told.
Be mindful of your surroundings, trust your instincts, and most importantly, look out for one another. Sometimes the greatest safety measure is the care we show for the person next to us. Remember, behind every missing person story lies a truth. We are in pursuit of that truth.
Our next video will be about the enigmatic disappearance of Elisa Lam. The story of Elisa Lam remains one of the most chilling and unexplained mysteries of the modern era. A journey that began with a young woman's dreams came to an end in the heart of Los Angeles, on the rooftop of an infamous hotel shrouded in dark secrets. Those final, unsettling images in the elevator. Was it her own free will, or was she the victim of an unseen threat? Are the answers to these questions hidden in the dusty hallways of the Cecil Hotel, concealed in the depths of its water tank, or do they point to a far more complex reality? We will delve into the Elisa Lam case in its entirety, examining every detail, from the security camera footage and autopsy reports to the conspiracy theories and discussions about her mental health. Be prepared, because as we descend into the depths of this mystery, you will discover that the truth may be far more unsettling. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so we can embark on this chilling journey together. See you in the next video.